We welcome all of you worldwide. An extended edition of Bloomberg Surveillance. We're going to move through the morning here with a tumult of the British government. And of course, on the Bloomberg, what we do is look at sterling 112.72 after the announcement, I believe with a move up to 113. Guy Johnson is here. And Guy, for Americans, it is so much formed by the movies and not The Crown and the rest of it. But I'm going to go back to every movie Judi Dench has ever been in, which goes back to Disraeli and Gladstone. And we really, Guy, almost have to go back to the 1820s and 1830s for a moment. Is that the historical perspective Britain has? Or are Tories and Labour saying, enough, let's move on now in the present?
Well, I think the Tory party would desperately like to move on. I think that is certainly true. I think Theresa May has just set a record that was set by Prime Minister Canning previously. So there's some historical perspective here, Tom, as you take us back that far. I don't know what the rules are going to be governing this process. It's not just the 22 committee rules that need to be changed here. There's a bunch of other rules that need to be changed here as well. What process is going to unfold here, I think, is critical. Is this going to be decided within the parliamentary party of the Conservative Party?
Right.
Will they select their new leader, or will this ultimately have to go back to the grassroots? If that is the case, that could be an elongated period in which that process unfolds. And in theory, during that process, Liz Truss will remain Prime Minister. We don't know yet. I suspect that policy is being made on the hoof, rules potentially being changed on the hoof as well, Tom.
How much, to Tom's question earlier, Guy, how much is this really being driven by the tumult of a post-Brexit United Kingdom?
I think it's being driven by that. Ultimately, Brexit was meant to resolve a number of issues within the Conservative Party. I think we can clearly now make the decision that that has not been the case. The pandemic obviously has had a huge impact as well, not just in the UK. It has taken the UK to a fiscal position that was very different to the one we enjoyed in 2018 and 2019. So a number of things have changed here, and I think what is clear as a result of the pandemic is, and the inflation that has subsequently been generated post that pandemic, is that the market tolerance for a big shift in policy is relatively limited.
Guy, I want to go back to what Prime Minister Truss talked about, which is this distinction of members of Parliament of her party and the people of the Conservative Party. How far apart are they? In America, we have liberals and conservatives far apart from their elected officials. But how big is that canyon between the MPs and the people?
Right now, I don't know. But let's put it this way. The parliamentary party, the MPs, did not vote for Liz Truss. The Conservative Party, the grassroots, voted for Liz Truss. So it's my understanding is that the parliamentary party would like to keep this within the parliamentary party in terms of making the decision. Yeah. And there's some reasons for that. You could certainly get a more expedited decision on who will ultimately be the next Prime Minister as a result of that.
So we are just getting a headline from the Telegraph's hope that 1922 officers are meeting at 3 p.m. in Parliament, their time, so 10 a.m. Eastern. How much is this setting up for a general election? And can you give us historical perspective on the last time that there was this kind of electorate outcome?
The Conservative Party, the parliamentary party, will not want a general election. They have 2.5 years. The polling is abysmal right now. You would see a wipeout, almost a complete wipeout of the Conservative Party in Parliament were you to see that happen, judging by the current polling. So they are going to be playing for time here. They are not going to want to have that happen. They are going to want to put in, technocratic may be the wrong word, but that kind of government here. They are looking for stability. They are looking for a period of time in which the pantomime of what we've seen over the last few days can be forgotten.
Guy, what is the percentage of people, either MPs or the party, saying Boris to the rescue? I mean, it just seems so painfully, I don't mean painfully because I'm editorializing, but it just seems so apparent that's one solution.
Well, within the parliamentary party, I would have thought that number is relatively small. I've seen a tweet from Nadine Dorries this morning suggesting that. I haven't seen many others. Within the Conservative Party grassroots, I would have thought that arithmetic is slightly different, though, Tom. But within the Conservative Party that is represented in Parliament, I don't think that number is high. I come back to the point, they are looking for stability. I'm not sure the Boris Johnson administration really was emblematic of stability.
Guy Johnson with us. If you're just joining us on Bloomberg Radio and Bloomberg Television, a special edition of Bloomberg Surveillance, Lisa Abramowicz and Tom Keene in New York. John Ferro, regrettably off today here, as history is made in the United Kingdom. Joining us now, John Micklethwaite. He's editor-in-chief of Bloomberg News and, of course, a student of this with his many years at The Economist. And, John, I'm going to go to a single sentence from your colleague in crime, Adrian Wooldridge. You've written so many books with Adrian, steeped in history. Wooldridge, there are no parallels in British history. What is the Micklethwaite parallel this morning?
Well, unusual for me to agree with Adrian, but yes, I think he's completely right. There are no parallels, and indeed, you begin to have to look to places like Italy and the fast turnover of prime ministers there. And it's one of those moments where basically it's possible to feel quite sorry for Liz Truss, but slightly, as Guy pointed out, that everyone else has probably lost even more. The Conservative Party had lost a great deal. British people have lost a great deal in terms of much higher mortgage rates. You could even argue that the Labour Party, their inheritance, if they are eventually going to take over, has got immensely more difficult because there is just less room for things. Britain is now, we went over the edge. And when you go over the edge with the markets, it takes a long, long time for the markets to forgive you. And you can already see the Tories have rowed back on quite a lot of the more extravagant promises they made. But the markets still don't trust them that much, as we can see in the yields. So I think in general, yes, it is, technically I think she's the shortest since Canning. But by any measure, you're not really looking at modern British political history. You're looking at places which, rightly or wrongly, have sometimes been perceived with more rapid turnover of leaders.
You're saying the UK has gone over the edge with markets, which is a pretty dire tone, and understandably so because of what we're seeing in markets. Is a general election enough to begin to restore some of the credibility, some of the stability? Is Jeremy Hunt, a technocrat, the person to do it, or is this something that cannot be righted for months and potentially years to come?
Several things in that. Number one, Guy Johnson's completely correct. Nobody in the Conservative Party wants an election because it's like a football match that you're losing 5-0 at half-time. You're generally going to want to play the second half, if only to see if you can recover a bit. At the moment, they would get trounced, and so it would be like turkeys voting for Christmas. So that's really being parked in one area. I think that so unless the Conservative Party pulls itself apart so much that some rebels begin to say, look, we'd be better having an election, I don't think that's going to happen. I think in terms of what the markets are going to do and what the way in which Britain is perceived in the world, I think you did see, notwithstanding my earlier comments, you did see a fairly robust reaction to Jeremy Hunt coming in and taking a more grown-up approach to what things do, what things you do. But as you pointed out, and as I was saying earlier, it's very difficult once you've lost that basic sort of trust to get it back. If you look what Jeremy Hunt did, he actually renounced not just the stuff that the markets really hated, the kind of top-rate tax cuts and other things like that took it into much heavier territory. He also renounced a degree of the energy price cap, which the markets had sort of forgiven Britain for earlier. But once you lose that trust, you lose that ability. So the Tories are almost back in an earlier position. So I think it will take a degree of time. And one very interesting thing is it's very hard for any government now to do much outside of fairly wide parameters. If you look at what Labour wants to do, look what the Tories probably will do over the next couple of years, it's probably quite similar.
Right now, we have a headline. I feel like this is something out of a Hilary Mantel novel. The leadership of France saying, quote, Mr. Macron hopes the United Kingdom can regain stability as soon as possible. Our executive editor in terms of Brexit non-stability is David Merritt. He joins us today from Washington here in our special coverage of the resignation of the Prime Minister. David, thrilled to have you with us as you are steeped in our coverage of Brexit. How much is this resignation of the Prime Minister linked to that day when Brexit occurred?
Thanks, Tom. Yes, well, a lot of commentators are looking back in history to that moment in 2016 when the chaos really started to set in. And we've seen since that vote, David Cameron, of course, resigned the morning after that vote in 2016. And we've had now 3 other prime ministers forced out of office. And it's great to hear that bit of sledging there from the French president talking about the need for stability. But it has been a sort of accelerating process. And, you know, Brexit, we all lived and breathed, didn't we, Tom? You know, the turmoil, the twists and turns. Boris Johnson claimed that he'd got Brexit done, but obviously the after effects are still being felt. Many commentators talked about the extremities of the moves in UK markets of recent weeks being also linked to the fact that Britain was untethered, as it were, from the European Union, made it more exposed to some of these effects around inflation and the like that are going around the world. That is one lens on it, of course. You know, the Remainer voters still have a large voice in Britain. Yeah. It will be fascinating to see, though, now who emerges from this leadership contest. Are we going to see somebody who wants to start to reforge some connections back with the European Union, if they can actually try to kind of end the infighting in the Conservative Party? Brexit has not gone away. Boris Johnson did not get it done. It remains an open argument in Britain, and you're seeing the effects of that still.
David, to that exact point, you're asking about who the leadership will be. Well, one just removed his name from the running. UK Chancellor Jeremy Hunt will not stand for Tory leader. That, according to the spokesman from his office. How much are we looking at something that is a UK story, David, and how much is this, as we were just hearing from John Micklethwaite, does this represent a sea change where governments cannot get away with certain policies that they could in the past because of the interest rate regime, because of the bond vigilantes coming back?
Absolutely. You know, the theory in the Truss camp of the campaign was always that Britain has such a large and stable economy that the bond market will readily absorb all this extra debt to pay for, you know, they got away with it with the furlough scheme in COVID. They probably would have got away with it with this massive amount of spending to supplement energy bills, but they tipped it over the edge to borrow extra money just to cut taxes. And that argument seems to have now been settled, I think, probably for many decades to come. If anyone thinks in any G7 country, perhaps excluding the United States, that they can borrow to that level and the market will take it, I think Britain is now going to be the example why they can't.
On radio and television, our extended coverage of the resignation of the Prime Minister, Liz Truss. We welcome all of you worldwide. We'll continue to give you market data with sterling now 112.63. I'm going to call that a volatility and a little bit weaker here in the last number of minutes. Guy Johnson is with us. David Merritt is well with their wonderful experience on the British system. And, of course, John Micklethwaite with us, our editor-in-chief today. John, I want to speak to the middle ground. This ugly American says that means the Liberal Democrats. Is there a middle ground in British politics?
I think the middle ground is currently occupied by a mixture out of Jeremy Hunt and Keir Starmer. And what's quite very interesting is the idea that Hunt, who in many ways seemed to be the most likely compromise candidate. I went down to the House of Parliament last night. You talk to people. He seemed to be the person who, rather weirdly, the right of the Tory party had forgiven for opposing Boris Johnson in his leadership election, but he hadn't been obviously disloyal, and they seem more angry with Rishi Sunak. And the trick really over the next few days is going to be to get somebody who most of the parliamentary party can unite behind. But I think at the moment, the middle of the British politics is sort of occupied by Jeremy Hunt on the left of the Tories, and Keir Starmer, who has not done as much to detoxify the Labour brand as people like me thought he needed to do. I mean, he renounced anti-Semitism, he's got rid of those sort of things, but he has not really moved the party substantially to the middle, although he has talked about accepting some of the Tories' tax cuts. But at the moment, I don't see that the Liberals don't seem to be part of the picture at the moment.
John, what is so important here within, you know, the way I report this from New York is Mr. Sunak is a financial guy. Does the United Kingdom want a Draghi-esque financial guy to run the show to help get us out of the chaos?
They want somebody who's competent. And at the moment, the sort of list of competent people seems to involve Jeremy Hunt, Sunak, who I think more than any other person in recent British political history can justifiably say, I told you so, because what he said would happen during the leadership election to those aforementioned Tory members who Guy was describing. You know, he did actually tell them that if they elected Liz Truss, this is what would happen, and it has happened. But often in politics, the rewards don't go to the person who says, "I told you so," even if he tries very hard not to say that. So there's I think him, I think Jeremy Hunt, I think there are some other people who they can bring forward. Grant Shapps, who they brought back in, is one such person. But there's not a lot of people who people would immediately turn to. I went to the Tory party conference 2 weeks ago, and it did feel a bit like the end of the second term of a two-term American president visiting the White House then. The Tories have been in government for a long time. A lot of the people who got them into government in the first place, people like George Osborne and things like that, who most people would say was very talented, they have all left. And that there is not as much talent now. It is very like the end of a second term White House.
John Micklethwaite joining us, David Merritt as well, of the executive leadership of Bloomberg, about what just happened. Liz Truss saying, "I cannot deliver on the mandate on which I was elected by the Conservative Party," resigning. Guy Johnson in London parsing through all of the reaction, all of the headlines, who's in, who's out. Jeremy Hunt not in the running. Guy, what's the latest?
You do wonder whether Hunt could be persuaded. He has ruled himself out, but you do wonder whether, were the situation to develop, he may still be persuaded to occupy that role. I think that would be an interesting development here. I couldn't possibly stand. I'm not going to stand. Well, we'll see ultimately what happens here. As John says, the bench is not particularly deep at this point. They don't have in the Conservative Party the talent that some would argue they once enjoyed. But whoever it is, Lisa, they enjoy, I think, very limited room for manoeuvre. As John said, you are now, from an economic point of view, tinkering. You can't make big, bold moves. You can't make the kinds of changes that Liz Truss tried to do because you have been clearly warned off such moves by the markets. So whoever comes in, be it the next incarnation from the Tory party or the Labour Party, their room for manoeuvre is incredibly limited unless they start thinking about pulling bigger levers. Immigration, how would that change the UK economy? Rejoining the single market, how would that change the UK economy? Those are the only levers that are left, right. But recent history would dictate that those are very difficult and dangerous levers to pull.
David Merritt, a guy, he was mayor for 8 years, and then he was Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs, leader of the Conservative Party, and then Prime Minister with, I believe, a ginormous electoral victory. I am thunderstruck we haven't heard from Boris Johnson, even if it's a fatherly word in time of crisis. Where is he, and can you get him on the phone, David Merritt?
That is a very good question, Tom. And rest assured, our reporters are definitely trying to track him down. There was some word that he might be in the Caribbean, I think, actually. Probably.
I'll get on that right away, David. Don't tell Mick.
A pina colada in hand, watching all this unfold. But look, he's made no secret, or his associates have made no secret of the fact he'd love to make a comeback, right? And the implosion of the Truss project so soon, we've had some of his former ministers coming out and saying, look, there's only one person in the Tory party who has a mandate from the British public, and that person is Boris Johnson. He won that stonking majority just in 2019. He should be brought back to steady the ship. Stranger things have
hold on a
happened,
second,
so we'll have to see what he says.
David, is there really that much support for that? I mean, he says he'd be happy to step in and come back. I mean, are people really doing this at a time when people are seeking stability? I did point out the poetry of Liz Truss accepting the prime ministership from the Queen and then putting her resignation in to the King just days later. How much are people seeking stability, even if it comes in the form of Boris Johnson?
I mean, I think definitely people are seeking stability, no doubt about it. You know, the death of the Queen was a huge watershed moment for Britain as well. So, yes, some people are clinging to this idea that maybe Boris Johnson could provide that. Remember, he was the person who persuaded people across Britain to vote Conservative for the very first time. And yes, you know, through to a series of missteps, he was forced out of office. But he still does command huge loyalty from a big faction of the party. That's one of the reasons why Rishi Sunak is struggling so much. Now, I don't think it's yet broad enough, probably, to bring him back. But, you know, people are grasping around here at the moment for an answer to this problem of how do you govern an ungovernable Conservative Party at the moment.
John Micklethwaite, let's look at the wake-up call here for the Conservative Party, playing off your wonderful, highly readable monograph of a number of months
Well done, Tom.
ago. You know, I look, John, at the wake-up call that is ensuing right now. Lessons learned from Cameron, lessons learned from Theresa May, maybe from Prime Minister Johnson, certainly lessons learned from Truss. Is this the wake-up call for the Conservative Party?
There is. It really goes back to what David Merritt was saying. Tom, what you said is completely correct. You know, Johnson is a big beast in this. The one thing nobody has ever associated Johnson with his entire life, in this case I'm talking about Boris Johnson, not Guy Johnson, is stability. It's not what he does. But he did do one thing uniquely well, is he managed to knit together both a kind of working class, somewhat socially conservative vote, you might describe it, pro-Brexit, with the more traditional kind of free market southern votes of the Tory vote. So he did have that ability to do it. But the fact is those two are largely in conflict quite a lot of the time. And so the Conservative Party, you're right, I think they are reaching a period where they need to refresh. There is a reason why the Conservative Party is, I think, still the most electorally successful party in the Western world, depending on how you measure the Japanese achievement. They are very, very good at rebranding themselves. They were the kind of party of rather posh conservatism under Harold Macmillan. Under Margaret Thatcher, they became radical free marketeers. Then Cameron was a turn back to managerial conservatism, and he did pretty well until he didn't do well on Brexit. And then since then, they've been trying to mend these breaches. There has been this war within them over Brexit, and that could come out again in this. And I agree very much with Guy Johnson, is that actually if Jeremy Hunt does want to be leader, the solution of coming out saying he doesn't want to be it could be the cleverest thing that he's done so far.
As we try to understand where the trust lies or how to regain the trust, there's the divergence between what's happening on 10 Downing Street and how to regain trust in the city. David, I'd love your thoughts on how what the tumult is like among the financial players, among such concern about the pound, among such concern about borrowing costs, and whether there is a feeling that there can be a retention of some of these financial firms that were threatening to leave post-Brexit.
Absolutely, and I think the turmoil that I think the city has looked on in horror at the last couple of weeks. There was a feeling in the leadership campaign that maybe Truss was pro-business, was going to listen to the City of London and their concerns. They had this big plan they were calling Big Bang 2.0 to kind of turbocharge the City of London post-Brexit. All of that is now in tatters. We've got a premium on UK government debt. Yes, it's come down a little bit, but it's still there. And the reputation for Britain as a financial destination, a stable destination for investors, has been shredded. And I think it's going to take a very long time for that to come back. And conversations we've been having and our reports have been having with banks and investors in London, in the city, they are white with rage about the chaos that has ensued from this government. And investors around the world, we've spoken to people who've called the UK uninvestable, and this is a direct fallout of a Conservative government. It's going to take a very long time, I think, for that reputation to be healed.
We welcome all of you worldwide on Bloomberg Radio and Bloomberg Television. I would direct your attention to Bloomberg.com UK with wonderful coverage. Joe Mays and the team there really on top of this story, the resignation of the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. It seems we've said that too often here in the recent years. It is truly, and I don't editorialize here, chaos in Britain. Guy Johnson joins us this morning from Queen Victoria Street with our editor-in-chief, John Micklethwaite, and also David Merritt joins from Washington with his extensive leadership of our Brexit coverage. We do this with equities vacillating in the United States. Yields move higher. I've been watching the real yield now, a stunning 1.72%, but everything today talking towards yen at 150, and of course sterling we're watching was a little bit of weakness here, 112.56. John Ferro off today, but Lisa Abramowicz is here, and we bring back the gentleman from the Dartmouth bubble.
Yeah, how much are we looking at a reset driven by market action, which Danny Blanchflower has been talking about and watching? We pledged that we would get him back if anything developed. Something developed, but Danny Blanchflower, Dartmouth professor, joining us now. He is also a former member of the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee. The key question, what does the United Kingdom need to do, both from a fiscal and a monetary standpoint, to regain market trust?
Well, obviously, I think a period of calm is completely important. I mean, you used the word chaos. I mean, we spoke 3 hours ago about what potentially was coming. I think there's another party and group here we haven't really talked about, which is the general public, who are going to be hurting. And if we look back in the poll tax, it was actually dissent from the public. They refused to pay the bills of the poll tax. There were demonstrations. So I think everyone's correct about financial markets being important. But in a way, when a government is so far behind in the polls, there's been no mandate from the people. Their credibility, both in financial terms, but actually political and real living day terms, if you like. The woman on the Mile End Road omnibus is going to say, what's in this for me? So I think any government is going to have to calm that. And it's pretty hard to see without a general election how that would happen. So I think calmness is important, but it's hard to see how that's going to come. I mean, we're going to have a week when we don't know whether there's a leader there. How long is that leader going to be there? What support will there be within the Tory party? But in the end, it's going to come down to what support is there from the people. And I suspect when this government is 35 points behind in the polls, if you had an election today, they'd go from something like 350 seats to 4. So this baby isn't over. Even when you bring in a new prime minister, you bring in a new chancellor, you try and calm the city of London, and in the end, the people will speak.
David, what I'm going to do is watch Kate Blanchett tonight and Elizabeth so I can get up to speed on this as well. What we need to do is revisit the comments of Prime Minister Truss. Here is the Prime Minister before her resignation.
We set out a vision for a low-tax, high-growth economy that would take advantage of the freedoms of Brexit. I recognise, though, given the situation, I cannot deliver the mandate on which I was elected by the Conservative Party. I have therefore spoken to His Majesty the King to notify him that I am resigning as leader of the Conservative Party.
Liz Truss at the podium outside of 10 Downing Street this morning. John Micklethwaite, Professor Blanchflower alluded to this, and we speak from the distance of the colonies, but there seems to be a system, a process of parliamentary process, I guess is what I would call it, in the United Kingdom. Do you see any groundswell by the people that David Blanchflower speaks of for constitutional or process reform in a fractured British system?
I don't think I see much sign yet of demands for constitutional reform. I think a lot of people are very fed up and annoyed with the Conservatives. You can go to dinners in London and people will say, how on earth did this group of people get to elect this person who the MPs didn't want in the first place? And the answer is that it's slightly the same. It's not a popular comment to make in America, but it's not dissimilar to the way that Americans choose your leader. Party members vote in primaries. Well, that's what we had, a primary, and we ended up with Liz Truss. And I think what's happened is the people in our equivalent of Congress are now trying to re-elect somebody. It is a parliamentary system, and you get elected for a term, and so the Conservatives will try and stick it out. And sometimes you stick it out and you lose at the end. That's what happened to John Major. But at the current moment, there is a faint hope, and I would not put it as very high, but this is a very febrile atmosphere. There was a time barely, a year and a half ago that Boris Johnson looked completely indomitable, swept to one of the biggest election victories. He was out really quickly. Things are changing one way and the other. Labour is still unproven. That is the kind of faint hope the Conservatives, again, I was in the House of Commons last night, that's the sort of thing they're clinging to. I think they think that even if the polls come down to a mere kind of 10% Labour lead, that will be something where most of the people who are currently making the decision about which person will lead them now, that will make a big difference to a lot of them about whether they can hang on to their seats. But the key point is this is a parliamentary system. Parliamentary systems, in the end, it's about whether you have enough MPs to support the current government, and the only way in which this government will go is if some members of the existing government party start voting with the opposition on no confidence votes. Because at the moment, whoever's Prime Minister is not going to call an election rapidly.
Meanwhile, we are feeling the gallows humor of Great Britain right now. If you look at Twitter, it's lighting up with the lettuce one, the Daily Star coming out. The lettuce officially has outlasted Liz Truss and won. Guy Johnson's still with us from Queen Victoria Street. And how much are we looking at a scenario where there is this deep feeling of sadness in the public that's represented by some of these humorous memes, etc., but a feeling of chaos and anger?
Frustration, I think, is probably the word that I would use, Lisa. The British public is clearly frustrated with what they've seen over the last few days because it impacts their lives. Mortgage rates have gone up and gone up sharply as a result of this. You take a look at the latest inflation data, it is impacted by what is unfolding politically. So this is not something that is kind of distant to them in some ways. It is real and will impact the family finances on a daily and weekly basis. And I think that's where the difference between this crisis and other crises maybe is. It has had an immediate effect on so many people. And I think that they will be feeling that right now. They will be wanting stability. They will be wanting mortgage rates to come back down. They will be wanting a sense of stability in their own lives.
Joining us right now is Lizzie Burden from 10 Downing Street as we try to parse through the rapidly moving backdrop of events. Lizzie, what is the latest in terms of who's lined up to succeed Liz Truss? What will happen in the time when she will remain Prime Minister until her successor is named?
Well, Lisa, we know that Liz Truss invited Graham Brady to Downing Street today. It's not clear whether he told her that it was time to go, or whether she felt like the stack of letters of no confidence was going to get so high it would be a humiliation and she's gone. But what we do know is that it's going to be a week-long leadership election, by the end of which we'll have a new Prime Minister. And the names, well, the favourite right now is Rishi Sunak, the former Chancellor, who of course ran against Liz Truss over the summer and was the MP's favourite. But there is, well, of course they are. Boris Johnson's allies are arguing that he's got the biggest mandate because he was actually chosen by the general public in 2019, but whether the public's forgiven him for all the scandals when he was in number 10 is another question. And I would just add, where Guy is saying that, you know, real people they care about their mortgages, they've not just had the chaos of the Truss government, they've also had the chaos of the Johnson government throughout the pandemic and in the months leading up to his downfall. Other names on the list, Penny Mordaunt, she's been pretty much auditioning in the Commons, but Jeremy Hunt, who seems to be in charge here, has ruled himself out.
Lizzie Burden, thank you so much. Again, we welcome all of you on Bloomberg Radio and Bloomberg Television. We're going to say goodbye to our editor-in-chief, John Micklethwaite, for his perspective. John, thank you for joining us here out of your meetings this morning in London. And we continue with Guy Johnson, Professor Blanchflower at Dartmouth College. We'll get to here in a moment. And I do want to continue to David Merritt right now. David, you live this. You led all of our coverage here forward out of Brexit. And I want to link in here, David, that I will attend at the Metropolitan Museum of Art today their magnificent new show, The Tudors, Art in Majesty and Renaissance England. A newly minted King Charles is very much aware of that. In his first order of business, David Merritt, was to visit repeatedly Scotland, Wales, and indeed Northern Ireland. How will the boroughs of England take to this resignation? What does it mean, for example, for David Blanchflower's Wales?
Well, yes, you know, the question of the unity of the United Kingdom has been under much debate in recent years, ever since, and aggravated since Brexit, of course. We had Mark Drakeford, the Labour leader of Wales, losing his temper in the Welsh Assembly this week over the behaviour of the politicians in Westminster. We've had Nicola Sturgeon saying, look, this is just another example of why the UK government is dysfunctional and Scotland needs a chance to go independent. So, of course, chaos in Westminster fueling Mark Drakeford in Wales, to be clear, is not calling for separation for the United Kingdom, but really fueling the chances of those national parties in the other parts of the United Kingdom. There is a case at the moment before the Supreme Court over whether Nicola Sturgeon, the Scottish leader, can hold a new independence referendum next year without the permission of the British government. That is not widely expected to succeed, but she's now saying the next general election will be a de facto referendum on Scottish independence, i.e. if the SNP win a majority in Scotland, she will be able to declare that Scotland is an independent nation. I mean, the chaos that would ensue from such a kind of unilateral move obviously would be immense. We've seen examples of this in recent years in Europe, in Spain, of course. So, stability in Westminster really being craved for those who want to preserve the union as well as bring some sort of stability back to the economy.
David Merritt, thank you so much. And we know you are incredibly busy, so we'll let you get on with your day. David Merritt, thank you so much for your perspective, Senior Executive Editor for Bloomberg. Sticking with Wales, Danny Blanchflower, Dartmouth professor and former member of the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee, still with us. Is this a concern for you, Danny, that there will be the beginning of, or an acceleration in the fraying of the Union in the United Kingdom?
Well, it certainly seems so. Obviously, the Scots did not vote to leave. Neither did the Northern Irish. And in fact, what's interesting, if we've been talking about Brexit, the one place that actually has been growing pretty strongly is Northern Ireland, which is more closely linked to the European Union. So certainly, I think that, I've spent a lot of time in Scotland. The Scots don't feel part of this English right-wing story of trickle-down economics. I think the answer is going to be over the next few months. What happens is this libertarian right lurch, has that now gone? Where do we go? The popularity of Brexit is declining even in England. And obviously, you were right. The First Minister of Wales this week, famously a quiet man, lost his temper with some of the comments that were being made. So I think there's a real issue here. The support for Brexit, I think, seems to be declining. But ultimately, we're going to have to try and get through this chaos. I think that's the first order story. Let's just go back, in a sense, to all of this. All of this came because Truss didn't listen to comments of many people, including me. I said, Truss is going to have to go from Mrs. Stupid to Mrs. Sensible, given what she said as a campaigner. So she didn't do that. So we're in this position of chaos. Maybe this reordering will bring the country together. I doubt it, but it's hard to think, where does this go? This morning we didn't know where it was going to go. So where's it going to go in a month? Okay. I don't know.
David, I'm going to mention another David Stockman. What has absolutely stunned me in all of this, Professor Blanchflower, is we've been here before, and it's not a Daniel Yergin exercise in Commanding Heights. What it's about is Reaganomics 1 to Reaganomics 2. Now, within the American system, President Reagan didn't resign. From what you see here, and with the harsh financial ramifications that we've seen, including 7 standard deviation move and 30-year guilt, was this just Reaganomics 1 that couldn't get constitutionally to Reaganomics 2?
No, in a sense, I think that the big deal in many senses was that Reagan and Thatcher, whether you agreed with what they said, they had a political mandate. The people voted for it. So that was the first thing. Nobody voted for this. And in some sense, there was an economic credibility to what they did. What you saw Truss do, very much linked to what Quarteng did, was to essentially try and blow up the markets. There was no possible way of having these enormous unfunded policies. The market simply couldn't sustain them. So I do think that the lack of mandate, the lack of sensible pricing and thinking about what the ramifications were. Yeah. So I don't really think there is much of an analogy. Ultimately, it comes down to they didn't have a mandate. They not only didn't have a mandate from the people, they actually didn't have a mandate from within their own party. So that's what we're seeing, this unscrambling. The party didn't vote for Truss. 81,000 people out there somewhere in the southeast of England voted for them. And so there was no political credibility and there was no economic credibility. So I don't really see that analogy. In a sense, I've never heard anything like it. The various economists, Chris Giles in the FT, Dario Perkins have said the cost of borrowing in the UK has gone up and now they're calling it the moron premium. I wouldn't argue that anything we ever saw in the past was as bad as that. I certainly wouldn't say that.
If you're just joining us right now, Liz Truss, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, stepping down, announcing her resignation. She will remain Prime Minister as the race to figure out who succeeds her takes place. We are seeing a bit of firming up in the pound. We're seeing yields in gilts come down. This is the stability people were looking for. On a broader level, there is an issue, Tom, with is this the beginning of a trend of basically bond vigilantes, of market participants controlling the political outcome at a time where there really isn't the same kind of appetite for fiscal spending that there was over the past 2 decades.
Well, we're going to have to see how that goes in the next coming days with sterling 112.62, and we're watching, of course, the fixed income market in the United Kingdom with with lower yields. I guess vacillating yields here over the next number of last number of hours.
Yeah, although this really has been the theme of this morning, which is the reason why we've been really watching the yield story as a tea leaf 15 minutes here ahead of the U.S. Open. Kathy Jones of Charles Schwab joining us now. Kathy, how much do you really glean some sort of investment thesis from bond vigilantes rearing their heads and winning with political regime change?
Yeah, I think the story here is that as interest rates go up for most governments around the world, that the debt sustainability question comes back into play. Now, I think the UK is kind of a separate situation than most broader markets in the developed markets. But the story is now we have higher interest rates and higher debt levels, and it is going to be more difficult for governments to come in and use fiscal policy. They're going to likely be more constrained in this environment than they were over the last 10 or 15 years. And that's going to be a fact of life that will have to be dealt with.
What this comes down to, Kathy, and this is your wheelhouse, is we reinvent a risk-free rate. You're too young to remember this, but I remember when there was a normal risk-free rate with a 10-year real yield at 1.70, even printing 1.71 earlier for all, including a beleaguered United Kingdom. I'm sorry, that completely changes the framework of fixed income, doesn't it?
Yeah, we're back to, and actually I do remember those days quite well, we're back to a different era. And I think that we will stay here. It doesn't mean that nominal yields have to keep going up, because if the Fed succeeds in bringing inflation down, that real yield can stay high with inflation coming down. But I do think we're in a positive real yield environment, unless or until we hit some sort of a crisis and something breaks again and the Fed has to be a lender of last resort. But I do think there has been regime change, and frankly, this is great for bond investors. Real yields are great.
Kathy Jones with us from Schwab, and we'll continue with this discussion on the markets. A headline just out from the gentleman leading the 1922 committee. Mr. Brady says there will be a new United Kingdom leader in place by a week and 1 day out to next Friday, October 28th, which is, of course, very different than what we saw with the transition from Johnson to Truss. We are hugely advantaged at Bloomberg and in London with, on Bloomberg Radio, Stephen Carroll keeps us moving forward. He is encyclopedic on something less spoken of, and that is Northern Ireland within the United Kingdom debate. Stephen, we were talking earlier about Scotland, about Wales with Professor Blanchflower, with our David Merritt. There was King Charles III visiting Northern Ireland. How engaged is Northern Ireland? How important is this resignation of the Prime Minister to the fractious Brexit debate of two Irelands?
Well, what's been considered or continued under Liz Truss as Prime Minister has been essentially the status quo in Northern Ireland. They still don't have an executive there. There have been high hopes from the unionist community that Liz Truss, as someone who had put a bill to Parliament which would have allowed the British government to override parts of their Brexit deal with the European Union, that they would find a deal that would allow the restoration of government in Northern Ireland. That hasn't happened, despite the meetings that have taken place, quite cordial ones, in fact, under the Northern Ireland Secretary, Chris Heaton-Harris, who met Ireland's Finance Minister only a couple of days ago. Ireland's Deputy Prime Minister was in London yesterday meeting with his counterpart, Therese Coffey. This is a series of relationship building which has now essentially gone out the window, because the efforts that had been made towards progress are now essentially stalled again as the UK goes back into another set of political turmoil. And there's a deadline in Northern Ireland. They must have a deal to restore power sharing by the end of next week, or another election has to be called for the Northern Irish Assembly. So people are watching this very closely because it has a real impact on government in that part of the UK.
Stephen, my grandfather would say to me with great import that Dublin was closer to Wales than London was. And there's a whole geography question here, but the archgeography is the nation of Ireland. Do they tend to a unification now versus a few years ago?
Yes, much closer now than before the Brexit vote. That has been a massive change in Anglo-Irish relations, which had been largely improved after very fractious, as we all know, for many decades previously since Ireland's independence in the past 100 years. But since 2016, things have taken a turn downwards. And now it's a question of whether or not the new Prime Minister can set things on a path which allow for good Anglo-Irish relations. We already had the Irish Finance Minister saying that they're looking for stability out of the Anglo-Irish relationship because, of course, they want to resolve these problems. They want there to be good relations because of that open border on the island of Ireland between Ireland and Northern Ireland. We had that all-important demographic survey telling us that for the first time, Catholics in Northern Ireland who traditionally identify as Irish were in the majority for the first time since the creation of Northern Ireland. That was only a couple of weeks ago. We're probably many years away from the vote that is legally possible under the Northern Ireland peace deal, the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. That could happen, but that is in the gift of the Northern Ireland Secretary in London to give. So that will be something that certainly the nationalist side of the political divide in Northern Ireland will be watching very closely as the new government here is assembled. It's not a short-term issue. It's unlikely to arise during the lifetime of this government, but it is something certainly people are watching on for the medium to long term.
Meanwhile, we are looking at regime change in the United Kingdom, regime change in markets, regime change really spurred in part by inflation. And we have to keep going back to that as markets churn. We are seeing yields going higher as we try to figure out what this ends up as. And Kathy Jones of Charles Schwab is still with us at a time where, yes, the UK is a specific story, but we keep talking about how this is really spurred by a 10.1% CPI in the United Kingdom. The U.S. not far behind, Europe there as well. How much, Kathy, are we looking at a lack of willingness to really make the hard decisions to cause inflation to come down because of the political turmoil, also paired with the lack of perhaps the authority from certain central banking units?
Yeah, I think most central banks led by the Fed have made the decision that fighting inflation is their first and foremost goal. And so they've moved pretty aggressively, as have most other developed market countries. I think the problem going forward is that this focus is on current inflation, and they're not looking at future lack of inflation or disinflation or what comes after this, because they're so focused on achieving this goal in the short term. So it does set us up for a lot of volatility right now, and probably a great overshooting in terms of yields, because there's no confidence in the forecast coming from the central bank.
Lizzie, excuse me. Kathy, it speaks to the political instability of the moment. Now, we're not going to have resignations, I guess, on the first Tuesday of November in the United States. We've got central bank meetings coming up, the Fed, the Bank of England, ECB, I believe, on October 27th as well. Kathy Jones, you expect the same political turmoil, as Lisa mentions, to high inflation as we crash through the United States elections?
Well, I'm not a political analyst, and clearly inflation affects a lot of people.
Look, Kathy, today everyone's a political analyst. The Prime Minister just resigned.
I've never aspired to that. But obviously inflation, particularly gasoline prices, we know are highly correlated with consumer confidence and spending plans, and with political change. So that is clearly a big issue in the United States. I don't think it's at the acute level, however, that it was in the UK. Simply because gas prices have come down a lot from the peak, and we have this rise in real interest rates already at work. And the unemployment rate is quite low. We don't have the energy shock going on that Europe has with the Russia-Ukraine war. So I think things are a little milder here. I think there are other issues on the table as well. But clearly inflation is going to be an important one.
Kathy Jones of Charles Schwab, thank you so much, and for putting on the political analyst. Yeah, exactly. Although, just to give you a sense, I mentioned the lettuce earlier. The political analysis of Twitter is ahead of lettuce that was put out by the tabloids. Who would last longer, the lettuce or Liz Truss? And it has been declared, and the victory of the lettuce this morning. How much does this really highlight the sort of dark humor to sort of deal with a moment where it's being taken to Greg's for potentially a sandwich?
John Ferro working an 18-hour day at Bloomberg, and I went out for dinner in Mayfair the morning after the evening after Brexit, and the numbness that I felt in the streets. I don't think that's anything compared to what we've seen over the last number of weeks.
It is sobering.
We will continue our coverage. We welcome all of you on radio and television, a special edition of Bloomberg Surveillance. Coming up, more, the resignation of the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom.
This is an extended version of Bloomberg Surveillance. Welcome on radio, on television. Tom Keene and Lisa Abramowicz. John Ferro is off today as we are seconds away from the opening bell. Lower, that is the direction of travel. Not much. This is an afterthought considering the political news of the morning. And that's, to me, really notable considering where yields are. We were talking about the shift upward. Lower, we could see right now the 10-year yield, 4.15%, almost 4.16%.
And to go off script here, in our special coverage, we forgot claims. It was right when the Prime Minister came out of the door of 10 Downing Street. Have we seen with Mr. Cameron and Ms. May and with Boris Johnson, and claims gave Jerome Powell a 75 basis point statistic.
Yeah, which is not exactly what he wants. And there is this conviction
right now.
A good number. Good news
It's
is
terrible.
bad news. And that's what we're seeing on Wall Street, very much dominated right now by the United Kingdom. And Liz Truss stepping down, really highlighting, though, the tenuousness of an inflationary environment for political parties globally.
In our special coverage, we're on until Tottenham wins again, right?
So then we're going to be on to the day we die. Right now, we want to just get a sense, though, honestly. It is important to put this into perspective, and Michael Purvis can help us do that. Just briefly, before diving back into the political fray in the United Kingdom, Michael Purvis of Talbot Capital, as you've been parsing through all of the political discussion, how much of a message do you take back to markets, to this idea that they are in charge and they are imposing fiscal discipline?
Well, I think there's a really important overarching theme here that we can divine from this whole Truss episode here, which is that, look, the Fed has been on this sort of America First monetary policy that has been, of course, very hawkish as it needs to tamp down inflation here in the U.S. But when you have fiscal experiments overseas that are that Truss, put forward and that are not sensible policies, the what it means for global risk assets is really sort of magnified here. So you have a collision. What I'm saying here is that the range of big weird outcomes for the markets is much higher when you have this collision of bad fiscal policy with what the Fed is doing right now. And I think that's very, 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 very important. I mean, I think it's a fair statement that central banks generally like low currency balls here, right? It just makes their job easier. And we're in a state of where, we can talk about rate vol being super high and, of course, equity vols high, but FX vols are super, super high here. And it ultimately makes the central bank, we're all grappling through when central banks are going to be more, sort of not led around the nose by inflation and hydrocarbons, and when they can actually lead as opposed to be reactive. And these types of situations only make central banks whether it's the BOE or even spill over to the Fed, more reactive.
Michael, that's right where I wanted to go. Neil Shearing to join us later in this hour with a real focus on the United Kingdom economy. But as Mr. Purvis, folks, talks about vol and, of course, his careful study of the Pacific Rim and ADXY, it is thrilling to bring you this morning Nick Benenbrook. He is Wells Fargo international economist, but he viscerally understands the Pacific Rim with his heritage of New Zealand, and far more, is the only person on the planet who has been award-winning in foreign exchange in back-to-back years. Nick, I guess it's good you're not an FX strategist this morning. Purvis talks about FX vol. Give us the vol we're going to see on British pound sterling.
Well, I think certainly for the next few days, we can expect this volatility to continue. It might actually be in the upwards direction because you could argue that political and policy uncertainty is reducing in the United Kingdom. And so we might see a bit more of a relief and go back towards the sort of even up to the 113, 114 level. So, I think we're going to see some further up move. Over the months ahead, I think as dust settles, we'll start to see markets calm down a little, and we might actually start to see the pound, when it's faced with the reality of the UK economy, the pound might start to give back some of those gains.
Nick, to what Michael Purvis alluded to, and if it is Britain in crisis, maybe it's Hungary in crisis, maybe it's Thailand in crisis, will Jerome Powell need to blink because of the international economics and politics we observe?
No, I don't think you will have to blink. I mean, we would still expect a 75 basis point increase at that November meeting from the Federal Reserve. Of course. And as one of your, I think we still look for a 50 and eventually getting to 5% on the Fed funds rate. I think the UK events are instructive in the sense of it does come back, as one of your previous guests said, how sort of unorthodox or unusual are the fiscal policies. And, they were fairly unorthodox in the case of the UK, just in terms of the magnitude and the way that they were delivered. And it doesn't look like here in the US, for example, or even across the Eurozone in general, that we're going to see such expansive fiscal policies. So for the major markets, I think it won't be an issue. But for the markets that you mentioned, the likes of Hungary and Thailand, they may face some challenges.
Michael Purvis still with us. And Michael, I'd love to get your take on what Nick is talking about, that there is some more stability, but the stability speaks to a more significant downturn, at least in the short run, based on the lack of borrowing. How much are you factoring that into some of your outcomes and your theses?
Well, look, I think what this whole Truss episode really sort of reiterates is that we need kind of boring policy, if you will, right? And I think there's this inevitable tension where like a politician's one of their biggest enemies is surging food and energy inflation, and there's always sort of a temptation to put in novel fiscal policies when they're actually the worst things for the situation. So we kind of need to see things get a lot more boring. But I agree with my co-guest that I think if for the major markets here, if things can be a little bit more static and stable, then more of the blowups will be relegated to more the niche markets here. But I think if the takeaway here from this Truss situation is that she's gone and we're going to go to a much more technocratic and less quote unquote innovative fiscal policy, so responses to this high inflation, that's going to be sort of enhance market stability here, which is sorely needed.
Perhaps another way of saying talk of MMT might have died a very rapid death over the past few months. Nick Benenbrook is still with us. I am wondering what this means in terms of energy policy for Europe at a time when a lot of nations, including Germany, were looking to spend extensively to stave off some of the gaps in the household budgets. Does this torpedo some of that, or does that pressure the euro and just German yields higher in a way that hasn't fully been realized yet?
No, I don't think it's going to derail those energy price plans that we've seen across Europe. I did see some estimates the other day, maybe in the region of 40 to 50 billion euros to sort of help support the energy price plans there. And, even going back to the UK experience, it wasn't so much the initial energy price cap that caused the consternation on the part of market participants. It was the the growth plan in late September and the unfunded policies there. So coming back to my earlier comment, I don't perceive the extent of fiscal support or fiscal expansion that they're talking about across Europe as being so dramatic that they'll have to move away from those policies.
Nick Benenbrook, just for you, and with such respect for your FX ability to call over the years, I looked at sterling New Zealand dollar. I don't know what that's called. Is that sterling Kiwi? Is that the fancy talk? I've never done it.
Me. I love this.
I've never done it before. But Nick Benenbrook, the bottom line is massive New Zealand strength over 20 years, and now we're buttressed down at the low end, a strong New Zealand dollar trading range. What are the ramifications for the global system if we see things like sterling Kiwi break out to new sterling weakness? That's an instability that Michael Purvis was talking about.
Well, again, I think coming back to your previous comment, though, Tom, it depends on the extent of volatility and just how dramatic those moves are. I've been around for a while, 20 years, maybe even longer. We've seen some unusual things. The Australian dollar trading above parity against the US dollar, for example, would be one of those. So I think if this is just reflective of maybe increasing commodity prices in general and just the relative performance of these economies, then if you continue to move in that direction, so long as it's orderly, I think it's not problematic. It does. 20 years ago, I was living in London for a couple of years, so maybe I should be living there now. It would have been much nicer given the Kiwi sterling exchange rate.
Wells Fargo international economist Nick Benenbrook, thank you so much. Also, our thanks to Michael Purvis for your guidance here. I do want to just bring you, and we've been talking about the lettuce concept for a while, but the reason why I find this interesting is because this has been just lighting up Twitter with Aldi stores in the United Kingdom putting out a Twitter post saying, what a great day to be a lettuce, and it's gotten, it's just
on this.
Well, the reason why is because it perfectly encapsulates both the issues with food as well as just in terms of the gallows humor. I keep going back to this because where do we get that feeling of, oh my goodness, we're seeing our mortgage costs go up, we're seeing our energy costs go up.
This is from Aldi stores.
Yeah, this is from Aldi stores in the United Kingdom. What a great day to be a lettuce, and people are loving it. They're all sorts of other memes, etc. But it really does highlight the moment. That's why I keep highlighting it.
We welcome all of you of Global Wall Street and all tuning in on radio and television. An extraordinary day. I'm going to do a quick data check here, starting with sterling, 112.58. Red and green on the screen. Thankfully, equity market's not giving us a story in the middle of earnings season. I guess I could say the 10-year real yield out to 1.71% is news, and United States yields are higher today. It's all been overwhelmed by the international relations of the resignation of the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Let us listen to Liz Truss earlier this morning.
We set out a vision for a low-tax, high-growth economy that would take advantage of the freedoms of Brexit. I recognise, though, given the situation, I cannot deliver the mandate on which I was elected by the Conservative Party. I have therefore spoken to His Majesty the King to notify him that I am resigning as leader of the Conservative Party.
Prime Minister Truss from that podium outside 10 Downing Street and the long walk back through that famous black door. Joining us now, Lizzie Burden is at 10 Downing Street. She's been on this story from the get-go. Lizzie, a general question for those of us not up to speed. How unified is Liz Truss's fractured Conservative Party?
Whatever the opposite of that is, completely divided, and these divisions have been sown for years, perhaps going back before Brexit, and that's what's so difficult in this leadership race. We heard from Graham Brady, the chairman of the 1922 Committee of Conservative Backbenchers, just now, saying that there's going to be a leadership election by Friday. And Rishi Sunak may be the bookie's favourite, but he's incredibly divisive in the party because he's seen as having brought down Boris Johnson, even though he would be such a shoo-in to Jeremy Hunt's economic policies, he faces such a mountain to climb. But what you might see, even though this party is so divided, is that because there's such a fear of a general election, they know how divisive a leadership contest internally can be, that they all just fall behind one candidate and it doesn't actually have to go to the party membership.
Is Jeremy Hunt just playing hard to get? Does he actually want to be Prime Minister?
No, but this is all that markets care about, that Jeremy Hunt is safe. You've seen a lift in the pound and gilts the last time I had a look. And that's because markets are confident that these fiscal plans are going to go ahead. Graham Brady also said that the fiscal statement on the 31st of October that we were expecting is going to go ahead. It means that the Bank of England can take account of that on November the 3rd. And yeah, it's really all markets care about.
Lizzie, thank you so much for your coverage this morning through surveillance. I know you're going to be there through the United Kingdom afternoon, but we all Lisa and I and John greatly appreciate your effort today at 10 Downing Street. We return to Guy Johnson getting ready for a 10 o'clock effort in New York. And of course, not only up to speed on all of this elite talk, but I think Guy Johnson's got a spectacular knowledge about the other people as well.
Can I bring this out?
I'll let you bring this up from a very good source, Swinford over at the Times of London, and then you can go to Guy Johnson on this.
Well, Boris Johnson.
To Johnson.
Yeah, exactly. The Times of London is saying that Boris Johnson is expected to stand in contest at a time when perhaps, where was he? The Caribbean? And people are wondering or trying to find this. But Guy Johnson is with us. Guy, your reaction to this headline?
Maybe he will cut his holiday short. Maybe he will return. It's interesting. So you've got a sort of two-stage process here. And I think we need to think about those two stages as being distinct. So it was interesting to hear what Lizzie had to say about the possibility of one candidate ultimately being put forward. Is there the tolerance within the Conservative Party after the huge volatility we've seen over the last few days for a Boris Johnson return? Is that something, are they prepared to go back to what was a fairly chaotic effort inside 10 Downing Street from Boris Johnson and his team? Or are they looking ahead thinking what we need here is actually stability? And Boris Johnson, as John Micklethwaite was putting out a little bit earlier on, not exactly synonymous with that, Tom.
My amateur take, Guy, is Johnson was thrown out because of scandal, cocktails, whatever it was. I don't remember the details. I don't care. Are the Brits, as Ferro would say, are they forgiving of that to say you were thrown out, you served your punishment, and would we see a different or new Prime Minister Boris Johnson October 29th?
There's been very little evidence of a new Boris Johnson, but I guess anything is possible. Boris Johnson, I suspect, is very popular within the Conservative Party grassroots, i.e. the party, but within the parliamentary party, which ultimately is going to decide which two candidates go forward, I don't know. And that is where the challenge for Boris Johnson is ultimately going to be here. Clearly, he would like to return. Right. Clearly, he is interested in retaking 10 Downing Street. But nevertheless, he has got to convince the parliamentary party that that is a good idea. And I think they threw him out because they were sick and tired of the turbulence. We just had even more turbulence. I'm not sure that they want any more
but Guy,
at this point.
There's also an issue here with the overhang of Brexit, because Boris Johnson oversaw the whole process. How much is Brexit still a popular decision, especially in the wake of the turmoil that we've seen over the past couple of months?
It's still a hugely divisive issue, Lisa, and as we were hearing earlier on, it is not a completed project. And therein lies the problem. Boris Johnson didn't get Brexit done. Do we want to return to the instability also that the issue of Brexit, when pursued aggressively, can generate? The Northern Ireland Protocol, we haven't talked much about that, have we? But it still lingers as an issue. It was interesting to hear what Mr. Macron over the channel had to say an hour or so ago.
Yeah.
The issue now is that the parliamentary party is in job preservation mode. Is Boris Johnson Is that boosterism, is that cakeism going to be enough to get him back into prime position? I don't know.
I want to frame the next 13 minutes for you folks, why you need to stay with us on radio and television. Neil Shearing's going to be up next with piercing conversation, but I've got to continue with Guy Johnson on the former prime minister. Is there almost a yearning by all for Boris, I can't believe I'm saying this, Guy, but Boris stability? I mean, is that the emotion that we're going to see into the British evening?
I think that's an oxymoron, Tom, but yes.
I was going to say so.
Could you put Boris Johnson and Jeremy Hunt together? Remember, they competed. You asked the question a little bit earlier on.
Come on. Are they on
does
speaking
Jeremy Hunt
terms?
want to be prime minister? He competed to be prime minister. What I think is interesting about Jeremy Hunt is, has the Boris wing of the Conservative Party forgiven Jeremy Hunt for basically competing with Boris Johnson? I suspect the answer is yes. Have they forgiven Rishi Sunak? I suspect the answer is no. So, and that's where I think all of this becomes extremely interesting as to kind of which factions are positioning sort of behind which candidates. But I think I come back to this issue. We have just had a huge bout of instability. That is something that the Conservative Party, I think, is desperate to put behind them.
Guy, how much, as we look to the likelihood of a Boris Johnson kind of prime ministership, yet again, are people looking for a celebrity versus a technocrat?
I think that comes down to the same issue, Lisa. They would like to be able to win the next general. They would like to be able to win the next general election. Are you going to do that with celebrity, or are you going to do that with stability? And we've still got 2 odd years to go until that general election. The searchlight of public opinion has yet to really settle on the Labour Party and its leadership. It will do at some point, and it will be a huge challenge for them.
I think my solution there to Guy and to you, Lisa, is that Kenneth Branagh ought to come back and run for prime minister since he was just doing the Boris movie as well.
Guy Johnson in London, thank you so much for your coverage throughout the morning. I'm sure we'll be hearing much, much more, and you'll be joining starting at 10 for full coverage. Right now, we want to get a sense, just going to the economic picture, really at the core of the turmoil and the core of what's to come. Capital Economics chief economist Neil Shearing joining us now. What's your sense, Neil, of how the ramification of this will play out for the United Kingdom as the world's 6th largest economy at a time of such tumult, both from the leadership as well as, honestly, from an inflation standpoint?
Well, look, the 6th largest economy at the moment, but factor in the weaker pound, it may not be the 6th largest economy for much longer. I think that the key thing, and you touched on this in some of the reporting earlier, is less at the moment who's in number 10 and who's in number 11, who's running the Treasury, what they're saying about fiscal policy, the extent to which there's a steady hand on the tiller there in the context of all the tumult that we've seen over the past several weeks. Now, the news that Johnson might be back and putting his name on the ballot paper, I think is literally the last thing that the UK bond markets will want to see. So let's see how that one plays out. But the economic picture is pretty grim, I have to say. There's a huge squeeze in real incomes coming down the track. Interest rates have got to rise further, irrespective of what's happening to fiscal policy. The housing market looks vulnerable to me. The Bank of England needs to do more work to squeeze inflation out of the system. Every which way you look, there are challenges.
Neil, I want you to talk, and you've done great work on this at Capital Economics. I'd really say industry-leading work on the polarity. The delusion, folks, is I go from Heathrow in on a limo to the fancy hotel, walk across the street, enjoy Queen Victoria Street, fly home and say I went to England. And that's, of course, a complete fiction. Neil Shearing, outside the elite climes of London, how bad is it for the United Kingdom economy?
It's bad. It's bad in London. It's bad in the United Kingdom generally. I think you're right. There is huge disparity, both of economic growth and income growth, and also wealth within the economy, and that's greater to a much greater extent in the UK than is in the case in other European cities, and there's other European countries, and there's lots of reason for that. poor infrastructure, poor skills, poor dispersion of technologies across industries within the UK. But you're correct. I mean, London and London in the southeast, incomes and income growth are far higher than is the case elsewhere in the country. But this is not the case that the rest of the country is suffering while London is powering ahead. London is going to suffer in this downturn too.
You talked about the sixth largest economy for now and where it was headed. What do you see in terms of what kind of downturn you're expecting and how this turmoil really plays into it?
Well, look, in terms of the pure economic downturn, I think we're staring down the barrel of probably a 2% fall in GDP, something like that, peak to trough. I think a lot of that will be felt in the household sector, consumers coming under enormous pressure, the housing market and construction coming under pressure too. The question really is whether or not that, in turn, there's feedback loops through the financial system that amplifies those shocks and makes things even worse. Now, interestingly, I think the interesting question from the market's perspective is how much of that is now priced in. It's interesting that the Truss has resigned this afternoon, London time, and the bond markets didn't really move. The currency markets have not really moved. The big move came last week when Hunt came in, unwound a lot of the fiscal measures. And so I think a lot of that risk premium that went into the UK markets has probably already unwound itself.
Neil, we are advantaged to close with you today. Thank you so much. Neil Shearing for Capital Economics. Again, I can't say enough about the firms where get their research from Capital Economics. We protect the copyright of all of our guests. I'm going to say this now, Lisa, rather than at the end when we're rushing and crashing to break and we're worn out and all that. What an effort by our team today, and that we really didn't see this coming. I would say last night about 11 p.m. New York time, I was like, oh, tomorrow.
Yeah.
But we really, Qantas and the team really pieced this together today with, I think, a great set of voices within Bloomberg and outside as well.
And we have an incredible stable of talent here at Bloomberg. Just to take a step back, to really paint the picture, the shortest tenure of a prime ministership ever, going back, the second most, going back to the 1800s.
Canning, to the early 1800s.
To the early 1800s,
pre-Disraeli.
and that was ended by tuberculosis, highlights how fast this had moved. I keep going back to this, that Liz Truss accepted the prime minister role from the Queen and then handed in her resignation to the king because of the transition in power there, the transition in the sort of metaphor of some of this turmoil. How much does this reshape politics in the UK going forward?
I agree, totally.
And highlight the turmoil stemming more broadly from an inflationary regime that is new, at least over the past couple of
Kit
decades.
Jukes with a brilliant note of SocGen today on a 112.46 sterling, alluding to resilient dollar, sterling weaker. But I agree with you that there's ramifications here that our David Merritt talked about, not only for England, not only for financial London and Edinburgh, but also for Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland.
And John Micklethwaite saying that this political moment went over the edge for this market.
There will be continued news, Lizzie Burden tells us, into the evening of London. Please stay with Bloomberg on radio and television. The Prime Minister has resigned.